Hello and welcome to lecture 3. This lecture is going to be on ethics. So ethics, why should you care about it? That question's actually an ethical question. See, when you ask questions about why you should care about anything, you're already considering ethics. Ethics is fundamentally the study of how you should live your life, how you should make decisions in relation to the actions you're going to engage in. It's how you can make decisions, it's how you can make better ones. Do you consider yourself too much? Do you consider yourself too little? What do you really want in life, and what is worth wanting? Some of the biggest and toughest questions in our lives are ethical. Do you want a child? Do you think abortion's right or wrong? Should it be made legal or illegal? Is euthanasia justified or not? Should you live for your own happiness or the happiness of everyone? There are so many decisions that you make in your life, and ethics has to be able to give you a way of explaining, or perhaps not explaining, how you can make those decisions. What is good and what is bad? What is right and wrong? How do we understand how to gain knowledge of what is good, bad, right and wrong, if possible? Is that good, bad, right and wrong considered objective or subjective? Can it be understood generally, or is it circumstance dependent and we cannot make a theory about it? These are some of the questions that ethics has to contain, whilst also giving applied examples.
Before we begin, I just wanted to let you know about my free webinar, which will help you plan your philosophical studies by helping you avoid mistakes and apply best practices, as well as providing an example reading list and structure so that you can begin your philosophical studies. Now, back to the video.
So in order for you to get your foot in the door with ethics, you're going to have to understand that there are 3 categories or subcategories in ethics: metaethics, normative ethics, and applied ethics. Metaethics is the study of ethics itself. Questions about ethics. Questions about whether ethics is objective or subjective, whether there can be a known right or wrong. These are metaethical questions. Questions about the way in which we do ethics. So metaethics really is about the first principles in ethics. What do we mean by words like good and bad in the first place? The next is normative ethics. Normative ethics is really concerned with what is a right or wrong action or right and wrong behavior. Actually getting to the sort of meat and potatoes, if you will. If you have a specific ethical theory and it tells you how to engage in the world, that is the normative component. It is the way in which we would evaluate an action, the way in which we would understand and compare one action or one behavior to another. And then the third and final is applied ethics. That is taking your metaethical, then normative ethical theorizing, and then applying it to reality, giving real concrete circumstances in which you can analyze and understand whether your theory is actually fitting reality or whether it's maybe not so well designed. Now, applied ethics is about scenarios. It's thought experiments, typically, or scenarios. So you might talk about, let's say, is abortion right or wrong? Is there such a thing as a just war? How should an individual act if they are in danger of their life? Should they be able to use lethal force to defend themselves? What scenarios would mean that it was excessive force? These are applied ethical situations, okay? And these give us greater insight into how our normative theories are panning out. Look at it like this. If you have a framework that has certain fundamental principles, when you apply those principles to real life, you'll see really what you're getting from your ethical framework. Obligations you may or may not have, how it would impact others, certain ripple effects that would have otherwise evaded you if you weren't thinking about applying it to reality. Ethics is fundamentally a very practical subject. It's not something that's meant to be purely theoretical. It's about behavior. I'm going to take you through the most common theories in those 3 subdivisions so that you can get a flavor of how ethics is structured. I want to be clear in this. Not all of your study will be split like this. You can learn about metaethics, but really questions in metaethics are normally part of some greater overall thinker's ethical system. Someone like Kant will be answering questions in metaethics, normative ethics, and applied ethics. The only way you'll get specific and maybe shortened answers to these questions is if you only look in journals. If you only look for journal articles and resources focused around these specific questions. Most philosophers deal with a wide variety of questions And especially in continental philosophy, it's very much about the propagation of a worldview, showing that a whole worldview can be coherent and putting together a system. Now, this is very much true for classical and continental philosophy. However, analytic philosophy is far more subdivided. So you'll probably find that if you go into analytic philosophy, it'll be more like this. It'll be specific abstracts and papers. However, there are some brilliant classical and continental philosophers, and if you don't know how to engage with them, it would just be a tragedy. So what you can always do is go, well, how would a thinker answer this question? Or you can even find resources that specifically look towards how certain thinkers might approach specific metaethical, normative, or applied ethical dilemmas. So, without further ado, let's get into it. So in metaethics, we will begin with what is called moral realism or moral anti-realism. Moral realism is a collection of theories in metaethics that holds that moral facts exist in the world and we can know them. Well, moral facts exist anyway, and most will affirm that we can know them. Arguably, some will say otherwise and that we can't know them, and I'll get onto those specific examples in a minute. But most moral realists will affirm there are moral facts and we can know them. According to Phil surveys, most philosophers are in fact moral realists. Most academic philosophers who are surveyed have actually answered yes, they believe morality is real, that there is actually a real right and wrong answer to how you should behave in your life. It's not something that is subjective or maybe based on pure preference. They believe that there is a specific right and wrong answer to how you should live your life. Now, this means very little over how you would understand these theories. Moral realists come in all different shapes and sizes. You could be a moral realist with a metaphysic and epistemology which is vastly different to someone else. You're looking at the world in such a different way, coming to wildly different conclusions about behavior. Someone who is a nominalist or an empiricist, they might believe that what is right and wrong is reducible to an individual's desire. That desire is objective, and it might be based on some sort of evolutionary naturalism. You're a human is an animal. Animals have specific wants and desires, manifestations of good feelings. Those good feelings are objective and true. And so what is actually good is the satisfaction of your individual desires. And that is all. You might come to like a psychological egoist position like Thomas Hobbes, in which case ethics is all about how to get what you want, how to maintain what you want, how to not get killed, and how to have a stable society. That's really how an empiricist might, not all, a specific nominalist engages with ethics. On the other hand, you could have someone who is an Aristotelian. They believe that the world is made up of abstract objects, universals, and particulars, concrete existence. Because of this, there is an objective right and wrong that binds people together in a collective. So there is a good and bad end for all beings, and specific beings or specific groups of beings have their own specific ends, usually tied to the species. So there'll be a good for zebras, there'll be a good for humans, and these goods are often related to an overall greater good which is more universally defined. The good of nature, the good of the universe, the good of everything, like the good itself. They might believe that there is a God and that God determines what's right and wrong, so that all individuals can only engage in what is good for themselves if they engage in what is good for the collective. Rather than this self attitude, you end up with what is good for us. How do we engage in a good life together? You can see there's massive differences there. One was all about self-orientation and how to live their life for themselves, while the other is about the group, the collective, right? And these aren't even that far apart. There are metaphysics which are much further afield from each other, and epistemologies which are much further afield from each other. That's moral realism, the belief that there are moral facts in the world, and usually they will say we can know them. The inverse of that is moral anti-realism. This is the exact opposite. There are no moral facts in the world. And usually you can't know them because there are none. This doesn't mean that they don't have any normative ethics. You'll find that there are moral anti-realists who do engage in normative ethics, just to sort of shake things up a bit. But it means they don't believe there is an objective, usually objective, moral fact in the world. So they would normally fall into what is called subjectivism. Essentially, what is right and wrong is dependent upon how you feel. Now, this is very different to what I mentioned before in egoism, even though it might sound the same, because you might be like, oh, well, it's all about the self, the same as egoism, because moral egoists think there is a right and wrong, like as a moral fact of the matter, where a moral anti-realist would say there is no fact of the matter. There is only what you believe to be true, or what you think might be true, or your attitude or disposition may be. But there is no fact of the matter. So this leads us on to the next collection of theories in metaethics, which is moral cognitivism and moral non-cognativism. As you remember from the epistemology lecture, a proposition is a truth-apt statement. If I say, hey, you shouldn't do that, it's wrong, a moral cognitivist would argue that is a truth-apt statement, which means it can obtain truth value, which means it is knowable. Moral non-cognitivism is an alternative approach that really developed sort of coming off the end in the back of the late Enlightenment, G.A. Moore, AJA, and the logical positivists, the Vienna Circle. At the birth of analytic philosophy, you can see moral non-cognitivism. Now, moral non-cognitivism is essentially the belief that moral statements are not propositions. They are not truth apt, which means that beating up strangers is wrong would not be truth apt. It would not obtain truth value. It's actually usually considered something like an expression of emotion, maybe a dispositional state, or a statement of approval or disapproval. It's not a proposition, it's not truth apt. Normally you would find non-cognitivists are anti-realists. They're typically subjectivists. Those individuals who believe that morality is reducible to a subject. They would normally say like something like science might be objective till you tell you about facts in the world, but ethics and moral philosophy is not. It's not like that. Now here come a very strange bunch, and this is error theorists. Error theory is a stance that there are moral propositions, but they are all untrue. Saying something like, it is wrong to beat up strangers is a proposition. It is in fact truth apt. However, there is no answer to this question. It will never be shown to be correct or incorrect. Some people will say error theorists believe that all moral utterances or propositions are in fact false. They do not believe that. Error theorists are arguing, like Mackey, usually that there is some sort of metaphysical reason that you cannot obtain truth value, but that there is in fact a proposition being made. So they're cognitivists, if you will, but the metaphysics isn't cashing out. There's no metaphysical grounding. Now, if you say that you can know a moral proposition is false, then you've gained some information about the world. Because if all moral propositions are false, then you know what is not true, which means that you actually have moral facts. Now, they don't want moral facts. They say you can't have them. So it's not that a proposition is false, it's that a proposition is untrue or not true. It's a really common error that many people make, even professional philosophers. So if you see someone making it, you can call them out at the next cocktail party right and go, aha, actually, no. I watched a philosopher online and he told me error theorists, in fact, don't believe all moral propositions are false. The next collection of theories I want to talk about in metaethics are particularism and generalism. Generalism is the belief that there can be moral principles, that these moral principles can explain actions and help us derive moral theories. Not necessarily universally, right? I mean, that might be a tad too far, but generally they'll say there are some moral principles, there are moral laws or moral truths that apply to all behaviors and all circumstances. Moral realists obviously are typically generalists. Not all of them, but very many of them are generalists, and they're looking for normative frameworks that can help you live your life. And the way you're going to do that is if you believe that there are a set of general principles that will help guide you to make a normative framework. Particularists affirm the exact opposite. Good, bad, right and wrong is particular to the occasion. There is no such thing as a moral framework which will be applicable to various circumstances in your life. It will not exist. It cannot exist because good, bad, right, and wrong are particular to the occasion. This is very tied to metaphysics and how you understand the world. If you understand that principles exist and that these principles are not just your names, but are in fact laws and general principles of reality, then you'll typically find that you're more likely to believe in moral generalism. However, if you're a particularist, you might see that ethics is either different, or if you're a particularist metaphysically, something like a nominalist, you believe that all that exists is particulars, and when we talk about essences or forms or kinds or categories of things, they are just nominal, meaning in name. There is no such thing as a general right and wrong. I don't know unless I'm in the situation. They might say I gain knowledge through the act of intuition. This is a type of particularism called intuitionism. They would argue that the application of intuition to an event is what allows for moral truth. Until you apply that intuition, you cannot actually perceive that truth. It's circumstance dependent and it's derived from that observation. And you can then start to maybe make moral claims about what you typically have perceived as right and wrong, but good is intuited from particular events. Okay, so let's move on to normative ethics. We've looked at the sort of metaphysics of ethics, or the metaphysics of morals, and the epistemology of morals. Now we're looking at structuring moral argumentation in all of its glory. Normative ethics is essentially the meat and potatoes, if you will, of ethical theorizing. This is where we build ethical systems. This is where we talk about how to actually live your life. So what are the main branches within normative ethics? First, deontology. Deontology is very much about working from moral principles. Deontologists are generalists in terms of metaethics. They believe that there is a principle right and wrong, and that we should live by those rational principles. And if we live by those rational principles, then we will be good people and we will live good lives. Deontology comes from the ancient Greek deont. Deont really means that which is necessary, and logos, science or reason. So, the study of duty, that's deontology. How should you live your life? What principles should you live your life by? It's looking for usually things like universal laws or rules and codes of behavior. Deontology is very rule-based. It is a rule-based system. So a deontological framework would be something like, you should always help others, or you must always care for the sick, or it is necessarily wrong to harm an innocent individual. Rule-based structures and moral principles in which you should apply to all situations. How we actually obtain these principles causes a lot of disagreement among deontologists. Some will say we can gain them from pure reason. Some will say we can gain them so just pure rational thought, observation, observing the world. Some will say we gain them from nature, from observing nature, for example. Some will say that we gain these principles through an active process which is constant and ongoing and ever developing. It also relates very closely to the other forms of normative ethics, which you'll find there's a great deal of overlap with. Something like natural law has aspects of deontology and virtue ethics. It's not just deontological, or it's not just consequential. It's not just virtue ethical. It's normally a combination of them all. Although virtue ethics is kind of already a combination of both deontology and consequentialism anyway, arguably. The most famous deontologist of them all really is probably going to be Immanuel Kant. Probably the most atypical deontologist you're ever going to meet. When someone gives you an example of deontology, they will say Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant famously said, act only in accordance with that maxim which at the same time you can will to become a universal law. So if it cannot be universally applied, it is off the table. It is irrational, in fact. That's not the only kind of deontology. Arguably, Hegel is a deontologist, or at least he has aspects of deontology in him, and he's very critical of that. So you find that this is a very atypical deontological example. It's the idea of absolutism, right? Absolute moral principles, absolute moral laws. The next collection of normative theories is consequentialism. Consequentialist theories argue that the best moral framework is that which brings the best outcome. So you might be thinking to yourself, well, don't we all actually want the best outcome? The difference is that it's not about living to rational principles, having done your duty, done the right thing, even if it leads to a worse circumstance. Instead, you must do that which brings the greatest amount of good. Now, that can be utility, that which brings the greatest amount of good for the greatest number, or it could be something in relation to personal gain in a kind of egoism. It could be something more collective. It could be something else entirely. Consequentialist theories are varied and fairly different from one another. And even in utilitarianism, probably the most common brand, there is a great deal of argumentation of what actually makes a good normative utilitarian theory. You'll find that pretty much every internet personality in the world is also a consequentialist because it is just sort of intuitive for our Western understanding of morals. We like to think, well, if everything turns out good, any landing you can walk away from was a good landing. It's probably the most common ethical intuition amongst individuals today. Obviously, Christians will probably be less inclined to argue for consequentialism because they'll see it as, well, wait a minute, there is a right and a wrong, and that was given by God, for example, which normally points towards principles. The third and final branch in normative ethics is virtue ethics. Virtue ethical theories argue that right action or just action is that which produces the most virtue. Virtues are character traits. These are things like humility or patience, courage. And likewise, there are vices. There is cowardice, there is greed and gluttony and pride. And so you can see how this is you can see how a Christian might also like virtue ethics as much as they like the deontological structure. There is a right and wrong, there are rules, the 10 Commandments, Judaism being very much about the laws, literally the laws. Whilst Christianity is more about the spirit of the law. The law is there, but what underpins it? Virtue. It'll be like character traits. How we actually foster a good spirit, if you will. So you can see Christians will often be like virtue ethicists. And virtue ethicists, if you think about it, already contain a consideration of deontology and consequentialism. Like, if you're a dutiful person, it's that you are living by rational principles and that you are trying to care about others, for example. And that shows that you are kind and considerate. It's not about the principle, it's about the consideration. Okay? But the principle is there. You can also say that in order to consider others, you need to consider the outcomes. Without considering the best outcome, you mightn't be able to be a virtuous person. You'll find that Plato, Aristotle, the Greeks were very, very invested in virtue, from Homer and other great poets, the Greek poets, okay? So you can see that virtue ethics is very much a very human collection of normative theories, if you will. But likewise, there is a great deal of difference even between virtue ethicists. What do we consider as a virtue? Alistair McIntyre, in his book After Virtue, goes through how virtue changes over time and how different societies and different cultures have understood different actions and practices. The ancient Greeks would have seen Jesus as vicious. They would have seen him as essentially too humble. He would be committing the vice of plorexia, essentially not giving himself enough credit, where a Christian would see that as humility. Those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. You see as a vice, I see as a virtue, and all your consideration of glory and being considered as the best for your society, I see that as a vice. And they'll give their own specific reasons as to why one should be considered a virtue or a vice. And so it will ultimately, once again, have to go back to metaethics, epistemology, metaphysics, and what Alistair McIntyre calls competing rational structures. Now, it's important to recognize that a virtue here, the character trait, is the good. It's not that the character trait brings about a good. It's not that considering others and being kind brings about a good outcome. No, being kind is in and of itself the good. That's what's really separating it from something like consequentialism. It's about fostering good habits, good dispositions, and considering others so that when you live your life, you experience a life as a kind, compassionate, or dignified person. And that is good. So typically, Plato, Aristotle, St. Thomas Aquinas, These are virtue ethicists. The next collection of theories is Emotivism and Expressivism. These are specifically tied to non-realism, but there's a debate on whether it's a cognitive or non-cognitive stance. Typically, they'll probably say they are cognitive, unless they say it is purely emotive, in which case it's not really a normative theory. Someone like Stevenson, for example, in his norm expressivism, would be considered a cognitivist. He's actually saying there is a right and wrong, but it's only in relation to himself. He can know whether something is true or false in terms of being a moral proposition, but that moral proposition does not obtain reality, it only obtains his emotions. There isn't sort of an objective truth about morality in the world, there is only a truth which is a coherence with himself. It's just the way I feel, but I'm trying to be consistent about how I live in accordance with my feelings. Another branch of that is Quasi-realism, where they say that morality is not real, but we are going to treat morality as if it is real, or that there are moral facts about us. It is very much about relating certain ethical judgments together. So I might have two competing moral inclinations. I might think I would never want to hurt anyone. I might also believe that I want to protect myself at all costs. They could clearly run into confliction. They can't both be true about myself. I can't really not want to harm anyone ever if I'm willing to protect myself at all costs, because one of those costs might involve harming someone else. You can see there's a lack of coherence there. They don't form a logically coherent structure. And so there is a very close tie to coherentism, at least ethically here, where what is right and wrong is derived from a coherence. How do I feel? Do I need to change how I feel if I can do that? Or maybe I need to understand my feelings in a bit better, depending on whether you're a prescriptivist, just someone who wants to export their feelings onto others. I think this is wrong, and you should think that it's wrong as well. Whether you are a descriptivist, so you think this is wrong and that's the truth about you. There are different ways you can go about creating expressivist normative theories. So consider that. There are still a variation in these normative theories. Someone who is a scientific realist, who's very much about scientific facts actually existing and that everything about them is determined by nature, they might see this as reducible to psychological conditions that have been produced by an evolutionary process. On the other hand, another individual might argue these emotions are changeable and malleable, and so they might say that this is not a changeable aspect about themselves. They are describing a concrete psychology. It is what they are. It's part of even what it means to be an individual. And on the other hand, an individual who is, let's say, more existential, they think that how they understand these scenarios is what structures the scenario itself. And so if they spend enough time thinking about these scenarios, they might actually come to understand these scenarios as different, or they may be able to force themselves in some way to feel differently about them. They'll change the way they feel. If you believe you can do that, you might argue that, well, I need to change the way I feel about whether I want to harm others or protect myself. And that will be how you come to the solution. Another one may say you are necessarily contradicted. If you can resolve this, it would be better. You mightn't be able to resolve it. And so there's a lot there, okay? There's a lot there. And it involves psychology. It involves how you conceive of the self and the subject. And there are people who will reject this outright and say it's a whole load of nonsense, okay? Last and certainly least, there is moral nihilism. Moral nihilism is the belief that there is no morality or ethics, that it just doesn't exist, that this is all pointless, that there is no right and wrong, and when we're talking about right and wrong, it's meaningless. The utterances are actually meaningless. That's very different to a subjectivist who will say that they maybe are meaningful, but expressions of emotion or attitudes or dispositions. And it might be very different from a quasi-realist who says, yeah, it's not real, but we act as if it is real, or maybe culturally relative. A moral nihilist will say, no, there is no such thing as morality or ethics. These are all meaningless. It is distinct from the non-cognitivist position, who will argue that the meaning of our utterances can be grounded non-cognitively. They'll actually say there is no grounding. Error theorists are arguably a branch of moral nihilists, but there are others. There are moral nihilists who are more glum and more depressive, arguably. Famously, Mackey believed that error theorists could engage in normative ethics. So they think they could have like a moral meaning in their lives, but that moral meaning isn't factual. Where moral nihilists don't usually even believe that there are meaningful moral conversations. You can't gain a moral truth about yourself. There is no moral truth. It's not even subjectively. Stop doing it. It's pointless. Probably the most depressive, I would argue, the most depressive theory in the world. But there are people who are moral nihilists. Probably need therapy, in my opinion. But, you know, that's not an argument. That's just an opinion.
You know, that's just like your opinion, man.
It's actually a great film for moral nihilism if you ever get a chance to watch The Big Lebowski. So, to conclude, you should have learned that there are three major branches in ethics. That is metaethics, normative ethics, and applied ethics. And you should have learned some of the most common theories in metaethics and normative ethics and applied ethics. Hope you've all enjoyed this lecture, and I will see you in the next one on politics, which is very, very close to this lecture. Remember, you cannot do politics without ethics. So take note of this one if you're interested in the next one. And I'll see you there.